my name's Jude Cobbing, and I'm a Senior Program Manager here at the Daugherty Water for Food Global Institute in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I'm here this morning with the 4 Yeutter Institute students who accompanied us on a trip to Ghana recently to learn more about small-scale irrigation. The purpose of the trip was to expose the students to some of the irrigation realities in Ghana and to deepen their understanding. They're here in the studio, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Over to you.
Hi, my name is Lexi Bodlak. I'm from Pender, Nebraska, which is in the northeast part of the state, and I'm studying agricultural communications and natural resource policy.
Hello, my name is Ethan Zen. Originally from Malaysia, I now double major in finance and economics with a minor in international trade.
Hi, my name is Zanib Al Razaq. My hometown, where I was born and raised, is here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I study economics and Spanish, and I also have minors in trade and agriculture and human rights at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln.
Hello, my name is Matthew Gillespie. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, and I study economics and political science with a minor in history.
Oh, it's really great to see you all again. I haven't seen you since the Ghana trip, so it's lovely to sit down and chat to you. So, was there something you particularly enjoyed working on this trip with Valmont, or anything that really stood out for you?
I really enjoyed the trip because before we even went to Ghana, we actually had to do research online. But actually going into the country, it reveals several layers that maybe you did not even think about before. For example, when we were researching, a big issue that came up was the land size. But once we actually went into Ghana, farmers never really complained about the land size. Instead, it was land tenure, electricity, or even just input prices like the seeds and all that kind of stuff.
You know, it was nice to go to Ghana just because, like Ethan said, you get a face to the facts and the figures that you learn, you know, just in preparation for that trip. And so it was really an awesome opportunity just to hear stories from farmers in Ghana, just to learn from their personal experience. Because when doing research, you know, before and after the trip, you know, there's just these high-level figures, you know, certain percentages here, certain percentages there. But to actually hear from the farmers themselves about what their personal experiences were was very helpful, because in many cases we were able to find, you know, for example, after the trip, that many of those facts and figures supported often the stories that we heard in Ghana. But there are also a couple other stories that we heard, or certain issues that we might not have otherwise found if we just, you know, were doing high-level research on our own.
I really enjoyed getting to hear the first-hand perspectives from farmers. It's one thing to do research, look at, you know, numbers and figures, but it's another thing to be able to ask those questions in person and hear a real person talk about these issues and how it affects them personally. And something else that specifically getting to hear like different nuances, getting to hear different things that, like, you know, a person like human to human you would pick up on rather than human to computer. That would prompt like further questions such as about culture, traditions, religion sometimes, or like gender differences, like, you know, so that I thought that was really interesting.
What struck me the most, and I think this probably happens just anytime I travel abroad, is how similar and yet how different people are. I had noticed just on our drive, I think anytime you sit down with a farmer and just ask them to tell you, like, just tell me about your farm or show me what you're doing. We had done that in Ghana and had an amazing experience. And then I had actually taken these 3 back to my family farm. And I noticed the exact same thing. I asked my dad and my grandpa, like, okay, now show them what we do on our farm. And just the similarities in the way that they talked, and like farming and agriculture and irrigation, like that's all part of a lifestyle. This isn't just someone's 9 to 5, it's a way of life. And so I just feel very privileged that we had the opportunity to go and see not only what like someone's job, but like how they live. And I think bringing in that human dimension to like a business aspect was just so important. And I think that's what I appreciated about DWFI's approach and just who they chose to bring on, not only as like us fellows, but also we had a sociologist and a policy expert and a hydrologist, and just really making sure like we encompassed all and every aspect of the supply chain to really truly understand the situation, not only from like a micro farmer perspective, but also just the greater system and problems that irrigation we're facing.
Thank you. I have another question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, How did going to Ghana change your understanding of the research question that Valmont set?
Yeah, so the original research question from Valmont really centered around their main product, which is center pivots, and how it can impact or how they can expand their business of selling center pivots in Africa. And so when we began working with DWFI, however, the opportunity arose, for the possibility of travel to some country in Africa, and then ultimately Ghana was chosen. And so it really turned into really more so a case study of Ghana and how prepared Ghana is for center pivot irrigation. And so that's what a lot of our research went into before the trip and during the trip, obviously talking to farmers about their experiences, their struggles, their opportunities for irrigation. And in Ghana, we visited many different parts along the supply chain, from farmers to dealers of pumps, etc. So it kind of changed the question into a more specific case study. And what we determined was really that that Ghana isn't really ready for center pivot irrigation, but other irrigation systems might be very helpful. So we gave a couple options for Valmont to consider, other irrigation types and things of that nature. And we also, with the help of Ethan, we developed a system of, sort of threshold questions to consider when pursuing, considering other countries as well. So that was very helpful.
I would say the biggest thing that stood out for me from actually going on the trip to Ghana instead of just doing research behind a computer was being able to really see how infrastructure played a big role in supply chain there. And so being in Ghana, I noticed that sometimes it would take us twice as long to get to our destination than it really should have. Being able to see sometimes that the roads weren't paved, how roads are in rural areas, how sometimes buildings are, sometimes they're not finished. Getting to really see that in person helped shape my perspective and my understanding of our research. That's not something that I would have thought to look up on Google Images if we had never gone to Ghana. And so being there, being in Ghana, getting to see everything with my own eyes, getting to get a real feel for what it's like to do business here, what it's like to live here, really helped shape my perspective on our research, my inputs in our research project. So that was something that stood out to me.
When we first started the research, I viewed the question as a yes or no. Yes, is it possible? No, it's not possible. Back up your answer by doing research, looking at the facts and figures. After going to Ghana, you see that this question is a lot more than just a yes or no. There are so many things that cannot be quantified into a number. It cannot be provided in a report by the World Bank. And although those figures do help, one thing that changed my perception of this question was seeing how can we provide this information to Valmont through our testimonies, through just speaking with the farmers and experiencing life there. One of the biggest things was trust. Trust is something that you cannot measure no matter how you try, but it was such a big thing, and it had a huge role in contributing towards whether farmer decided to follow a business, follow a system, and abandon their practices. In fact, even when we presented to Valmont, one of the people mentioned that in your report, you put in a lot of facts and figures, but how do you present the idea of tradition? Many farmers stick to their tradition and they do not want to change away from that. So the question really changed from yes and no, back it up with evidence, to what is everything and what are the most significant impacts on center pivot irrigation. Even if there's no quantifiable data, how can you show it to us?
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks, Ethan. And that's very interesting. Lexi, you're from a farming family here in Nebraska, so I guess you've got farming supply chains in your blood. You know what it takes to get a crop to grow and to market in Nebraska. Was there anything that stood out for you, the contrasts or the similarities in Ghana, in terms of Valmont's research question?
As a pre-law student, I just thought the lack of informality within the entire agricultural supply chain was just really shocking, and I think that's a huge disincentive to help a farmer to continue to invest in their piece of land or a new piece of equipment or whatever it is. So I vividly remember, for example, I just signed a grain contract this morning, so I know that as soon as I harvest my grain, I'm going to be able to sell it for this price, which is huge because that means I know I have income for the next next season. And what we learned in Ghana is there were women that would maybe bring like 1 cup of grain to get them, I don't know, maybe 10 cedis to get through the day, and they would rather bring another cup of grain tomorrow for another 10 cedis. So I just thought it was really interesting as far as like how transactions within the informal economy are working, and just how a lot of these agricultural activities aren't even necessarily being accounted for in something like GDP or just workforce development. So I think there's a lot that can be done, especially just like with formalizing some of these transactions and just within the legal system in general. Like, how can we further ensure things like property rights or water rights or consumer protection if there is a violation of a contract? I just thought those were just some really interesting questions that I think we had sort of taken for granted in the US. And I think another thing is farmer support, just from like the USDA or other governmental organizations. If there happens to be a natural disaster, like there's going to be some assistance. And in Ghana, like there really wasn't any support, and that if there is any, it comes from your community around you, which is likely experiencing the same challenge. So I just thought that was like the whole legal framework was just really interesting.
Super interesting, thanks for that. And there's an example of something that I didn't really think about in terms of Ghana. You know, all of the different areas of study that you all have and the different experiences that you have got me thinking beyond the hydrology into all of the different little things that have to be in place. So, you know, I think you probably all agree, you know, this is a complex problem, farming and irrigation somewhere like Ghana, and there are lots of elements to it. And I think the trip was an opportunity to see at least some of those. Any other comments at all while I've got you here on the couch, that things that sort of technical or supply chain things that from your studies stood out for you, and as either constraints or perhaps things that facilitated agriculture and farming in Ghana? Anything at all?
Yeah, I would say the main thing that I was thinking about during the trip that I really reflected on sort of personally in my own journal was just the level of economic development in Ghana in comparison to, you know, maybe very well-developed countries like the United States or lesser developed countries like I was in Costa Rica during the summer. And just sort of placing center pivot irrigation sort of within that context, and just thinking about, you know, anything from you know, pumps that they're using up to, you know, roads that they're driving on, or anything else even not related to agriculture. And so as an economics student, I was just kind of trying to take a higher level picture of the country and their economic development, and asking the question, I think, you know, in answering the question about whether Ghana is you know, ready for center pivot irrigation, I think in that question there's that hint of economic development. Are they well developed enough? You know, maybe, you know, because we decided that they're not ready for it right now, but are they in the future? What would be necessary in the future on an economic development basis for them to be ready for that product?
I think empowering farmers, I remember sitting with one of the sociologists there, and more often than not, they have a level of ingenuity and innovation that like you just need to capitalize. More often than not, we just need to encourage farmers and tell them that they're on the right track, or like gently correct and share what we know about like science-based backed research. And so I think something else is just like being mindful, like maybe this current system that we're using in this specific cultural context of the US is never going to fit in this country. And if it won't in that specific way, what can we change? And so, I mean, I think we noticed at every farm we went to, it's different. Everyone has a different story. And so like, how can you take this one piece of equipment and like allow other people to take ownership of it and use it for their needs and what best serves their communities? So I think recognizing that nuance and really embracing that, I think it's hard from a business perspective, but I don't think it would work if we don't recognize that.
Lexi, thank you. Anything else burning to say?
I agree strongly with Lexi, especially about empowering farmers, because we see that many farmers, they are hesitant to invest into the future because they're uncertain about the result it will generate. They might understand that irrigation or even center pivot irrigation is better. It's just the current premise of their problem is more important. We looked at one farm. They had solar pumps that draw water out from a well, but the solar pump broke. Instead of fixing it, they focused all their capital into the current season because they knew they needed money from this current season's crops in order to keep on pushing on into the future. And if they instead invested and fixed the solar pump, they might just completely void their current season yields. So there's so many facets towards making a decision that are so important to consider. Empowering the farmer, knowing that if you fix the solar pump now, it will actually benefit you more in the long run, will potentially help them frame how they should view the problem. And one thing you also mentioned was the electricity. You mentioned economic development. I appreciate how on the research online, you do not see it, but when you're actually there, you can view how farmers compare their benefit to the cost. And it's a very direct comparison, just like the one I mentioned about the solar pumps. But even when you're making investment decisions, they will actually list out their thought process about, yeah, this is how much money it's going to take. This is how much money I might need in the future. How should I adjust my decision to encompass that? And you see so many parts of the decision which, if you're not a farmer, you probably would not even think about.
I think that's a really good way to put it. Zanib, I'm going to leave the last comment to you. And what are your views?
I would say, just to add on to what Ethan and Lexi said, in addition to education, I would say the lack of trust. And this kind of technology really stood out to me. Farmers had every right to not trust this kind of technology. We learned there that there were pumps literally littered with there were fields literally littered with broken pumps because they had failed, or they were counterfeit from China, or that they just, they didn't work, or they couldn't figure out how to fix them, or they couldn't get the parts to fix them. So that had really stood out to me was farmers not being able to trust this kind of technology, and realizing that having demo farms, having pumps to demonstrate to other farmers, like to show them that they actually worked, was a successful way that a local distributor was able to get other farmers to purchase a pump. And so just seeing how to tackle the issue of farmers not trusting this kind of technology was interesting to me. Seeing the ways that the local distributor had gone about doing it was really fascinating for me. So
Great, thank you. Well, once again, it's such a pleasure to have you here and to see you again. And it was such a lovely trip. I wish we could go back again, and with a bit of luck, there are going to be further trips, and you're going to have been the pioneers for it. And I feel like I learned such a lot speaking to you. And in some ways, that's one of the biggest outcomes for us at DWFI. So thank you once again for the trip and for coming today, and very, very best of luck with all your endeavors going forward, and we'll see you soon.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for everything.